On the morning of November 27, 1936, the atmosphere within the Hôtel de Paris in Monte Carlo was heavy with the scent of saline mist and the oppressive aroma of beeswax used to polish the Louis XIV furnishings. This hotel, an architectural masterpiece designed by Godineau de la Bretonnerie in 1864, served as the final fortress for a man who had once been the most feared individual in Europe. Inside his private suite, Basil Zaharoff, aged 87, moved with the mechanical frailty of a dying titan. He was no longer the kingmaker who could collapse a Mediterranean ministry with a single coded telegram. He was a prisoner of his own history, occupied by a singular, final task: the systematic destruction of his archives. The fireplace, carved from Carrara marble and soot-stained from days of continuous use, consumed the evidence of a century's worth of international manipulation. Zaharoff fed the flames with mountains of high rag content paper, the specific chemical composition of the period's iron gall ink, turning the smoke a thick, acrid gray. These documents were the blueprints of the Gilded Age's bloodiest conflicts. Each ledger burned represented a shipment of rifles, a suborned general, or a falsified news report. By 1920, Zaharoff's personal fortune had reached a staggering $50 million ace. In the purchasing power of 2026, this equates to approximately $3.8 billion, a liquid net worth that surpassed the treasuries of several sovereign states he had helped arm. The macroeconomic reality of 1936 provided a grim backdrop to his final hours. The world was fracturing. The Spanish Civil War was hemorrhaging blood, and the Nazi regime in Germany was rapidly rearming, using the very industrial pathways Zaharoff had pioneered decades earlier. While the Great Depression had decimated the fortunes of the American industrial elite, Zaharoff's wealth remained insulated within a complex web of shell companies and Swiss accounts. He lived in absolute paranoia, employing a private security detail that rivaled the protection of the Prince of Monaco. These guards, armed with early-model Browning semi-automatic pistols, stood behind doors reinforced with specialized steel plates to prevent assassination attempts that Zaharoff believed were imminent every hour of every day. He had not allowed a photograph to be taken of himself in years. He understood that in the world of high-stakes arms dealing, anonymity is the ultimate armor. His suite was a museum of tactile luxury. Heavy velvet drapes that blocked out the Mediterranean sun, hand-stitched silk wallpaper from Lion, and silver breakfast services that were polished 3 times daily. Yet the luxury was hollow. His companions were not world leaders, but the ghosts of the millions of dead who had unwittingly financed his lifestyle. The cost of a single bullet in the 1930s was mere pennies, but Zaharoff had sold billions of them. His legacy was written in the ballistics of every major front from the Balkans to the Somme. The technical silence of the room was interrupted only by the rhythmic tearing of paper and the crackle of the fire. The chemistry of the aging process had turned his skin into a translucent parchment, his eyes shielded by round, gold-rimmed spectacles that reflected the orange glow of the burning secrets. He was the mystery man of Europe, a title bestowed by a press that both hated and feared him. As the final scraps of a contract with the Vickers Company turned to ash, Zaharoff knew that while the documents were disappearing, the machinery of war he had built was now self-sustaining. He had taught the world that peace was merely an unprofitable lull between sales cycles. But to understand why the wealthiest man on the planet spent his final morning cowering in a hotel suite, fearing the very shadows he had once controlled, one must travel back to the filth of the Ottoman underworld. It was there, amidst the smoke of burning districts and the stench of the Levant, that the merchant of death first discovered the high profit margin of human terror. Basil Zaharoff was not a product of the European aristocracy. He was a creature of the chaos that defined the mid-19th century Ottoman Empire. Born Zacharias Basileos Zakharov in 1849, his origins were rooted in Tatavla, a destitute and dangerous Greek quarter of Constantinople. In the 1850s, the city was a labyrinth of wooden structures, highly susceptible to the catastrophic fires that frequently leveled entire neighborhoods. This environmental hazard provided Zaharoff with his first masterclass in predatory economics. He began his career as a pimpante, a multilingual street hustler who guided wealthy tourists through the city's opium dens and brothels. But his true apprenticeship was served alongside the tulumbachu, the irregular fire brigades of the era. These brigades operated on a system of pure extortion. Using primitive hand-pumped engines made of brass and wood, they would race to a burning home, not to extinguish the flames, but to negotiate a price for their services while the building disintegrated. Zaharoff learned that desperate men do not haggle. If the owner refused the price, the firemen would simply watch the house burn, or in many documented cases, loot the remains. This was the foundation of the Zaharoff philosophy. The more intense the crisis, the higher the commission. In a world of fire, the man who controls the water, or the fuel, commands the market. By 1870, the macro context of the region was shifting. The Ottoman Empire, known as the sick man of Europe, was struggling with modernization, creating a vacuum where a clever opportunist could thrive. Zaharoff's first major criminal act involved his own family. He was sent to London to work for his uncle, Sevastopoulos, a merchant in the lucrative grain and textile trade. Within months, Zaharoff had embezzled $7,000 from the firm. In 2026 currency, this theft represents approximately $1 million, a fortune for a 20-year-old immigrant. He fled to Belgium, but his uncle's reach was long. Zaharoff was apprehended and returned to London to face trial at the Old Bailey in 1873. The trial was a technical exhibition of Zaharoff's lifelong talent, dissimulation. Standing in the dock of the Victorian courtroom, an architectural space designed to intimidate with its high oak benches and cold stone floors, he didn't act like a thief. He acted like a victim of a misunderstanding. He utilized his 5 different passports and a fluid grasp of multiple languages to confuse the prosecution. The legal costs of the era were high. A barrister's fee could exceed $100 per week, and Zaharoff's ability to navigate the nuances of British law allowed him to escape with a light sentence and a swift return to the shadows of the Mediterranean. During this period, Constantinople was undergoing a transformation. New technologies like the telegraph were connecting the Levant to London and Paris, but the streets remained a primitive theater of survival. The cost of living for a common laborer was less than 2 piastres a day, while Zaharoff was already dealing in thousands of pounds. He had moved beyond the street fire brigades. He understood that the fires of the future would not be set in wooden houses, but across national borders. He began to cultivate an aura of respectability, trading his street rags for the tailored frock coats of a businessman, though his soul remained that of the Tatavla arsonist. The London underworld and the Ottoman slums had taught him that morality was a luxury for the poor. For the rich, there were only contracts and leverage. He began to observe the burgeoning arms industry, noting the mechanical limitations of the single-shot rifles and the early unreliable Gatling guns. He saw a world preparing for a technological leap in violence, and he positioned himself as the bridge between the inventors of destruction and the kings who craved it. The petty thief of Tatavla was about to encounter a machine that could fire 600 rounds per minute, a device that would serve as the scepter for his global empire. The transition from a common swindler to a global power broker was nearly complete, but it required one final catalyst. In the humid workshops of London, a new kind of fire was being perfected, and Basil Zaharoff was the only man with the lack of conscience required to sell it to every throne in Europe. In the late 1880s, the technology of slaughter underwent a fundamental mechanical shift, moving from the manual crank of the Gatling gun to the automated recoil of the Maxim. Basil Zaharoff did not invent this machinery, but he became its most proficient apostle. The Maxim gun, engineered by the American-born Hiram Maxim, was a marvel of Victorian physics. It utilized the energy of each shot's recoil to eject the spent cartridge and chamber a new round, achieving a firing rate of 600 rounds per minute. Technically, this required a sophisticated cooling system. The barrel was encased in a brass water jacket holding approximately 7 pints of liquid. After 3 minutes of continuous fire, the water would reach its boiling point, emitting a plume of steam that became the signature of the modern battlefield. Zaharoff recognized that this was not merely a weapon, but a paradigm-shifting commodity. The macroeconomic landscape of 1888 was defined by a frantic European arms race. The scramble for Africa and the simmering tensions in the Balkans created a desperate demand for portable firepower. Zaharoff's role was to navigate the intense competition between the Maxim Gun Company and its rivals, such as the Gardner and Nordenfeldt designs. During the infamous Vienna trials, Zaharoff demonstrated his mastery of industrial sabotage. When the Gardner gun was presented to the Austrian military, it jammed repeatedly. Zaharoff had secretly met with the rivals' technicians, utilizing sublimation to ensure the machinery was improperly calibrated. He then presented the Maxim as a flawless alternative. His commission for these maneuvers was astronomical. A single successful contract could yield him $500,000 in late 19th century currency, which, when adjusted to the purchasing power of 2026, represents a liquid infusion of $15.2 million. Zaharoff's most audacious exploit during this period involved the Nordenfeldt Waffen, the world's first modern submarine. Architecturally, the vessel was a disaster. It was 64 feet long, displaced 60 tons, and was powered by a 100-horsepower steam engine. Technically, it was dangerously unstable. Because it lacked internal bulkheads to manage the movement of water in its tanks, the submarine would tip uncontrollably if a crew member walked from the bow to the stern. Furthermore, the steam engine's heat made the interior temperatures nearly lethal for the crew during submersion. Zaharoff ignored these engineering failures. He sold the first unit to Greece, playing on their nationalist fears of Ottoman expansion. Once the contract was signed, he traveled to Constantinople and informed the Sultan that the Greeks now possessed a secret underwater weapon. Terrified of naval obsolescence, the Ottoman Empire purchased two. Finally, he convinced the Russian Empire that the presence of submarines in the Mediterranean threatened their southern fleet, securing a third sale to the Tsar. The logistical complexity of these deals required Zaharoff to operate a shadow network of bankers and diplomats. He collaborated closely with Thorsten Nordenfeldt, the Swedish industrialist whose name graced the submarine, but it was Zaharoff who handled the special accounts, the euphemism used for the bribes paid to naval attachés and ministers. In the Ottoman deal alone, he distributed thousands of gold liras to members of the Sultan's inner circle. The cost of living in Constantinople for a high-ranking official was roughly 50 liras a month. Zaharoff was offering single payments of 5,000. He was effectively out-earning the sovereign states he serviced. By 1890, Zaharoff had ensured that the Maxim gun was the standard-issue weapon for the British, German, and Russian armies. Archive records from the period reveal the Zaharoff system in its nascent, most lethal form. He would often purchase blocks of shares in local newspapers in target countries, using the editorial pages to manufacture war scares or report on fictitious military buildups by neighboring rivals. This psychological engineering forced governments to accelerate their procurement cycles. He understood the chemical composition of fear and how to convert it into the cold steel of a naval contract. His influence was so pervasive that he began to bypass middle-market agents entirely, dealing directly with the heads of state who were often the primary shareholders in the very banks financing the arms purchases. While Hiram Maxim obsessed over the metallurgy of the gun barrels, transitioning from iron to specialized steel alloys to withstand the 3,000-degree heat of combustion, Zaharoff obsessed over the metallurgy of power. He was no longer a salesman. He was a strategic consultant to the collapse of the old world. He had mastered the art of selling the disease and the cure simultaneously, a cycle of obsolescence that ensured his coffers were never empty. Yet as his wealth reached the levels of the old world nobility, he realized that a mercenary, no matter how rich, is always vulnerable. He needed a legitimate throne from which to command his burgeoning empire of lead. By 1897, the merger between the Maxim Gun Company and Vickers Sons and Company created the first true military-industrial titan: Vickers, Sons, and Maxim. Basil Zaharoff did not merely join the firm, he cannibalized its foreign policy. Vickers was a British institution headquartered in Sheffield, the heart of the world's steel production. The technical backbone of the company was its mastery of the Harvey process, a method of hardening steel armor plates by saturating the surface with carbon at high temperatures. This allowed for the construction of warships that were virtually impenetrable to the shells of the previous decade. Zaharov became the director of foreign sales, a title that masked his role as the architect of global naval escalation. Under his direction, Vickers's annual profits climbed from $500,000 to over $5 million by the turn of the century. In 2026 values, this represents a surge from $250 million to a staggering $2.5 billion in annual surplus. The macro context of the early 1900s was the Anglo-German naval race. The introduction of the HMS Dreadnought in 1906 rendered every existing battleship obsolete overnight. This was Zaharov's ultimate market condition. He utilized the Vickers system to ensure that for every ship built for the Royal Navy, a corresponding order was placed by a foreign power, often a British rival. He facilitated the construction of the Rashad Fee for the Ottoman Empire and the Rio de Janeiro for Brazil, vessels so massive they required the dredging of entire harbors. The logistics were immense. A single dreadnought required 25,000 tons of steel, 2 million rivets, and the labor of 3,000 men working for 3 years. Zaharov oversaw the supply chains for the 12-inch wire wound guns, which utilized miles of high-tensile steel wire wrapped around an inner tube to prevent the barrel from bursting under the immense pressures of cordite propellant. Zaharov's primary-secondary character during this rise was Albert Vickers, the chairman of the company. Vickers was a man of the British establishment, but he lacked the moral flexibility required for the emerging global markets. Zaharov provided that flexibility. Together with the financier Sir Ernest Cassel, they created a triangle of power that bypassed the British Foreign Office. Cassel provided the international credit lines, effectively loaning countries the money to buy Vickers weapons, while Zaharov ensured the political will to spend that money existed. This was a closed-loop economy of destruction. In Russia, Zaharov's influence was so profound that he was rumored to be the third man in the cabinet of Tsar Nicholas II. He suborned the Grand Duke Sergius and the Russian Naval Department, ensuring that Vickers-designed armaments were used in the fortifications of Port Arthur, despite their technical inferiority to German Krupp designs. Archive curiosities from the Vickers ledger books of 1904 show a line item for special expenses, which in reality was a bribery fund that Zaharov managed with surgical precision. He did not merely hand out cash. He utilized the graft of the Orient. In the courts of the Far East, he would provide consultancy fees to the wives of ministers or donate lavishly to local charities that were nothing more than laundries for political payoffs. The cost of a single 12-inch gun was approximately $10,000, roughly $1.2 million today, and Zaharov's personal commission was often 5% to 10% of the total contract value. He was accumulating wealth at a rate that outpaced the industrial output of many small nations. Technically, Zaharov was also a pioneer in the logistics of the Shadow War. He established the Société Française des Torpilles Whitehead, securing a monopoly on the world's most advanced torpedo technology. The Whitehead torpedo was a mechanical masterpiece, featuring a hydrostatic valve and pendulum that maintained the weapon's depth and a twin propeller system to counter torque. Zaharov ensured that while the French produced the torpedoes, the British built the ships that carried them, and the Russians bought the mines to defend against them. He was the invisible thread connecting the armories of the world's great powers. He lived in a world of high-velocity steel and low-frequency whispers, moving between the shipyards of Barrow-in-Furness and the casinos of Monte Carlo. By 1910, the Merchant of Death had become the eminence parda of the global arms trade. He had successfully manipulated the naval laws of 1898 and 1900 in Germany, triggering a response in Britain that guaranteed Vickers work for 20 years. He was no longer just selling guns. He was engineering the geopolitical necessity for their use. He had become a man of such immense utility to the British Empire that he was granted an honorary knighthood, despite never having held a British passport. The mask of the respectable industrialist was now firmly in place, constructed of Harveyized steel and reinforced with the silence of 1,000 suborned officials. But even as he reached this peak of strategic consolidation, A single spark in a remote corner of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was preparing to ignite the very fire he had spent 30 years fueling. By 1910, Basil Zaharoff had transitioned from a clandestine operative to a monumental figure of the Belle Époque, residing within a social stratum where the line between private wealth and state treasury was effectively erased. The primary theatre of his opulence was the Château de Balancourt, an estate in northern France that epitomized the architectural arrogance of the era. Originally designed for the Marquise de Courcelles in the 18th century, Zaharoff purchased the property for 10 million francs, an amount that, when adjusted for the inflation of luxury assets and purchasing power in 2026, represents roughly $80 million. The technical restoration of the chateau was an engineering feat in its own right. Zaharoff modernized the 300-hectare estate with an early industrial-grade central heating system, utilizing massive coal-fired boilers that circulated steam through miles of copper piping hidden behind ornate Louis XV wainscoting. The interior was a laboratory of excess. The Grand Salon featured gold leaf molding applied using a traditional water gilding technique that required months of labor from specialized French artisans, while the floors were composed of rare Carrara marble and inlaid parquetry of mahogany and ebony. The macroeconomic context of this period was the zenith of the gold standard. International capital flowed with unprecedented ease, allowing Zaharoff to move his commissions through a labyrinth of European banks, from the Crédit Lyonnais in Paris to the various private merchant banks of the City of London. While the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 decimated the rural economies of Southeast Europe, conflicts Zaharoff personally fueled by supplying both the Bulgarian and Serbian infantries with Vickers-produced rifles, the Merchant of Death was preoccupied with his private transport. He traveled across the continent in a bespoke private railway carriage. Technically, this was a masterpiece of Victorian logistics, featuring a chassis reinforced for high-speed stability and an interior insulated with layers of cork and horsehair to eliminate the rhythmic vibration of the tracks. The carriage included a dining room serviced by a personal chef and a communications office equipped with a private telegraph line, allowing Zaharoff to manipulate markets while traversing the French countryside. His terrestrial fleet was led by a collection of Rolls-Royce Silver Ghosts. The Silver Ghost was the pinnacle of Edwardian engineering, powered by a 7.0-liter side valve, 6-cylinder engine that produced a near-silent 48 horsepower. The chassis was constructed of high-tensile steel, with the exterior fittings, handles, radiator shells, and lamp casings composed of genuine silver-plated brass. Zaharoff demanded that his drivers maintain a strict maintenance protocol. The engine's leather fan belt was checked for tension every morning, and the internal lubrication system, which utilized a sophisticated set of gravity-fed oilers, was monitored during every journey. This mechanical perfection was the only environment in which Zaharoff felt secure. His cars were effectively mobile bunkers, designed to outrun the anarchists and assassins who haunted the industrial cities. The center of his power, however, shifted to the Mediterranean. In a move of predatory financial genius, Zaharoff targeted the Société des Bains de Mer, SBM, the entity that controlled the Monte Carlo casino and the most prestigious hotels in Monaco. The SBM was the financial heart of the principality, then struggling under the administrative weight of Camille Blanc. Zaharoff utilized his vast liquidity to quietly acquire a controlling block of shares, effectively becoming the landlord of the world's most famous gambling house. He overhauled the casino's security, installing a network of private informers and introducing the most advanced accounting systems of the time to track the flow of gold and banknotes. He didn't just play at the tables, he owned the house, the cards, and the very air the gamblers breathed. The casino became his private intelligence hub, a place where drunken diplomats and debt-ridden princes traded state secrets for chips. Archive curiosities of the era reveal that Zaharoff's dinners at the Hôtel de Paris cost more than the annual salary of a British factory worker. A single bottle of 1811 Comet vintage Madeira, or a rare Chateau d'Yquem, was decanted with a ritualistic precision that cost the equivalent of $100 today per glass. His etiquette was a weapon. He used the rigid social protocols of the Edwardian elite to intimidate rivals. often hosting 12-course banquets where the menu was designed to display his mastery over global supply chains, serving Russian caviar, Argentine beef, and Caribbean tropical fruits in a single sitting. Yet this golden labyrinth was not merely a display of ego. It was a camouflage. To the public, he was a billionaire hedonist, a philanthropist who donated millions to the University of Paris to establish chairs in aviation, the very technology that would soon revolutionize the reconnaissance and destruction of his enemies. Behind the marble walls of Balancourt and the silk curtains of Monte Carlo, Zaharoff was building a fortress of solitude, sheltering a secret obsession that would prove more expensive than any war. Basil Zaharoff's most complex engineering project was not a dreadnought or a machine gun, but the construction of his own social respectability. By 1913, he was an officer of the Légion d'honneur and a knight of the British Empire, honors bestowed not for his military services, but for the immense charitable contributions that served as his social mask. He donated over $1 million, approximately $35 million today, to the development of aviation research, funding the Zaharoff professorships in London, Paris, and Petrograd. This was a strategic calculation. He was financing the research that would determine the specifications of the next generation of warplanes, ensuring that Vickers would always have the technical lead. He also founded the Institut de France's House of the Students, presenting himself as a grandfatherly patron of European culture. The mask was perfect, polished with the same obsessive detail as the silver on his Rolls-Royce. The macro context of this period was the shifting legal landscape of the European aristocracy. The old houses were bankrupt, and men like Zaharoff were the new creditors. He operated within the Spanish court, a den of medieval protocol and modern corruption, where he encountered Maria del Pilar, Antonia, Angela Patrocinio, Simona de Mugairo, Iberuete, the Duchess of Marchena. She was his singular weakness, the only variable in his life he could not control with a contract. Maria was married to Francisco de Bourbon, the Duke of Marchena, and a cousin of King Alfonso XIII. The Duke was medically insane, a technicality that Zaharoff exploited with cold efficiency. He utilized his influence with the Spanish monarchy and the medical establishment to ensure the Duke remained sequestered in high-end psychiatric asylums, effectively removing the obstacle to his pursuit of the Duchess. To maintain his access to Maria, Zaharoff built a shadow life. He purchased a mansion on the Avenue Hoche in Paris, a structure that functioned like a high-security vault. The residence featured a hidden elevator system and reinforced steel shutters, allowing him to enter and exit without being observed by the paparazzi or rival agents. His love letters to the Duchess were encrypted using a private code based on the Vickers sales catalogs, a technical irony that blended his passion with his profession. When he bought her jewelry, he went to Cartier, the jeweler to kings and king of jewelers. Archive records from 1911 show a purchase of a diamond and pearl necklace for $500,000, a value of $15 million in 2026. The pearls were of a specific oriental luster, graded for their perfect spherical shape and skin tone compatibility, a technical standard of luxury that only a handful of women in the world could command. Secondary characters in this drama were often discarded like spent shell casings. King Alfonso III, a man whose kingdom was being modernized with Vickers-built railway equipment and naval vessels, turned a blind eye to Zaharoff's relationship with his cousin-in-law. In exchange, Zaharoff provided the king with investment advice that was effectively a series of high-yield bribes. Meanwhile, the Duchess's husband, the Duke of Marchena, became a tragic footnote, a man whose mental decline was accelerated by the isolation Zaharoff financed. The Merchant of Death was paying for the Duchess's loyalty with a currency of blood and steel, yet he had to wait 3 decades for a legal marriage. He was the most powerful man in Europe, capable of ordering the mobilization of fleets, yet he spent his nights in the Avenue Hoche, waiting for a coded telephone call. The technical layer of his mask extended to the very air he breathed. Zaharoff was an early adopter of advanced hygiene and medical technologies. He employed a personal staff of chemists to formulate bespoke perfumes and soaps, ensuring that he never carried the scent of the industrial cities he visited. He was obsessed with the chemistry of his own presence, wanting to smell of lavender and expensive leather rather than the cordite and coal smoke that generated his wealth. His life was a study in contradictions. He was a Knight of the Cross of the Redeemer in Greece and a Commander of the Order of Leopold in Belgium. These medals, pinned to his chest during state dinners, were the armor that protected him from the growing scrutiny of investigative journalists who were beginning to link his charitable donations to the massive arms contracts signed in their wake. In 1914, the mask was nearly flawless. To the world, Zaharov was a paragon of the new internationalist elite, a man who bridged the gap between the Ottoman past and the technological future. He sat in the center of a web of secret alliances, royal marriages, and bank loans that he believed would maintain the balance of power. He had sold the weapons, built the fortresses, and suborned the ministers. He believed he had engineered a world so perfectly armed that no one would dare pull the trigger. But as the heat of a Serbian summer reached its breaking point, Zaharov would realize that he had built a machine too powerful for even its architect to restrain. On June 28, 1914, 2 gunshots in Sarajevo ignited the mechanical apocalypse Basil Zaharov had spent 3 decades engineering. While the world viewed the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand as a diplomatic catastrophe, Zaharov viewed it through the technical lens of the Vickers order books. The Great War was not a tragedy of human politics. It was the ultimate industrial peak. As the European powers mobilized, the Merchant of Death became the most essential man on the continent. He was the only individual with the logistical authority to bridge the gap between the private armaments factories and the war ministries of the Entente. In the early months of the conflict, the British Expeditionary Force faced a catastrophic shell scandal, a technical shortage of high explosive ammunition that threatened the entire front. Zaharov, utilizing his position as the eminence parda of Vickers, orchestrated a production surge that bypassed traditional bureaucratic channels. He shifted the focus of the Sheffield Steelworks from naval armor to the mass production of the QF 18-pounder field gun, the workhorse of the British artillery. The technical specifications of these weapons were a testament to the Vickers engineering Zaharov championed. The 18-pounder utilized a hydro-pneumatic recoil system, allowing the gun to fire up to 20 rounds per minute without losing its aim, a rate of fire that consumed shells faster than any previous economy could produce. Zaharov didn't just sell the guns, he managed the chemistry of the slaughter. He controlled the supply of cordite, the smokeless propellant composed of nitroglycerin and nitrocellulose, stabilized with petroleum jelly. The manufacturing of cordite required immense quantities of acetone, a solvent that became the most precious chemical in the world. Zaharov utilized his global network to secure grain supplies for the fermentation processes needed to synthesize acetone, effectively controlling the very speed at which the war could be fought. For every shell fired on the Somme, a percentage of the cost, roughly 6 pence per casing, flowed back into the Vickers accounts and Zaharov's private commissions. Macroeconomically, the war was a total liquidation of the old world's gold reserves. By 1916, Britain was spending $5 million a day on the war effort, approximately $450 million in 2026 purchasing power. Zaharov's personal fortune grew exponentially during this period. His net worth tripled as he acted as a high-level intermediary for the Inter-Allied Munitions Council. Remy. He was the man who could secure 50,000 rifles from a neutral nation or divert a shipment of Serbian copper to a French foundry with a single signature. He was the primary advisor to David Lloyd George, the British Minister of Munitions and later Prime Minister, and Georges Clemenceau of France. These leaders did not merely consult Zaharov, they relied on his system to maintain the flow of steel. In Greece, Zaharov's influence was even more direct. To pull his homeland into the war on the side of the Allies, he spent $1.5 million, over $120 million today, in direct bribes to Greek parliamentarians and journalists. He purchased the newspaper Radio Paris and Le Petit Parisien to manufacture pro-war sentiment, a psychological operation that eventually forced King Constantine the Ferenc into exile and brought the pro-Allied Eleftherios Venizelos to power. Secondary characters in this theater were often overwhelmed by Zaharoff's shadow. While soldiers like the poet Wilfred Owen died in the mud, Zaharoff's rivals, such as the German steel magnate Gustav Krupp, were forced into a mirror-image industrial race. Zaharoff, however, had the advantage of the Vickers-Terni connection in Italy and the Schneider-Creusot works in France. He was the director of a pan-European web of destruction that paid no heed to borders. Archive curiosities from the 1917 Vickers Ledger reveal a special commissioner payment to Zaharoff of $200,000 for a single month's work, a fee of $16 million in 2026. This money financed his acquisition of more media outlets and his continued sequestration of the Duchess of Marchena in high-security luxury. While the common soldier's wage was barely enough to buy a tin of bully beef and a packet of Woodbine cigarettes, Zaharoff was dining on out-of-season truffles delivered by private train to his Paris residence. The ethics of the era were as malleable as the hot steel in the Sheffield furnaces. Zaharoff was accused of trading with the enemy through Dutch and Swiss subsidiaries, ensuring that German U-boats were, in some cases, equipped with optical sights or specialized alloys that had originated in Vickers-affiliated plants. To Zaharoff, the war was a closed system where profit was the only true sovereign. By the time of the armistice in 1918, he had been awarded the Grand Cross of the Order of the Bath and the Grand Cross of the Légion d'honneur. He was the man of victory in the eyes of the public, but in the eyes of the accountants, he was the man who had turned 20 million deaths into a personal credit balance of $200 million, over $12.5 billion in today's money. He had mastered the art of 1914, but as the smoke cleared, the world began to realize that the merchant of death had not just won the war. He had stolen the future. In the immediate aftermath of the Great War, Basil Zaharoff retreated into a level of paranoia that transformed his existence into a technical exercise in evasion. The mystery man of Europe occupied a fortress on the Avenue Hoche in Paris, a residence designed to be as impenetrable as the dreadnoughts he had sold to the Tsar. The architecture of his isolation was deliberate. The walls were lined with reinforced steel plates, and the windows were composed of early laminated safety glass, a technology then reserved for the windshields of military aircraft. He lived within the Chamber of Ashes, a private study where he spent 16 hours a day processing the documentary evidence of his life's work. His primary occupation was no longer the acquisition of wealth, but the destruction of history. The macro context of 1919 was one of profound disillusionment. The Red Scare was sweeping across Europe, and the newly formed League of Nations was beginning to investigate the private manufacture of arms as a primary cause of the slaughter. Investigative journalists from the Union of Democratic Control began to piece together the Zaharoff system, publishing pamphlets that labeled him a vulture of the battlefield. To counter this, Zaharoff utilized his intelligence connections. He was a deep-cover asset for the British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, and the French Deuxième Bureau. He worked closely with Admiral Sir Reginald Blinker Hall, the legendary director of Room 40, the British Naval Intelligence Unit. Zaharoff's network of agents, known in internal memos as the Z Organization, provided the British government with back-channel information on Bolshevik movements and Mediterranean oil concessions. He wasn't just an arms dealer, he was a sovereign intelligence agency in his own right, operating with a budget that exceeded the formal departments of many European states. The technical layer of his secrecy involved the use of advanced encryption and physical security. Zaharoff utilized a customized version of the Vigenère cipher for his most sensitive telegrams, a polyalphabetic substitution method that was virtually unbreakable without the specific keyword, which he changed daily based on the closing prices of the London Stock Exchange. His safes were custom-built by Chubb & Sons, featuring time lock mechanisms and manganese steel castings that were resistant to the newly developed oxyacetylene torches used by high-end burglars. Inside these vaults lay the blood money ledgers, records of the $5 million, now $350 million, he had distributed to Ottoman officials, the bribes to the Russian Grand Dukes, and the secret contracts that guaranteed Vickers a percentage of the munitions produced by rival German firms through pre-war patent agreements. Archive curiosities of the 1920s reveal the immense cost of Zaharov's anonymity. He paid a retention fee to several major European photo agencies, effectively buying the copyright to every candid image of himself to ensure they were never published. The cost of maintaining his private security detail, composed largely of former French Foreign Legionnaires, reached $2 million a year in 2026 values. These men were paid to be ghosts, clearing hotel floors before his arrival and monitoring his food for traces of arsenic or cyanide. Zaharov's paranoia was not without foundation. He had survived at least 2 documented assassination attempts, one involving a letter bomb and another a sniper in a Balkan railway station. He became obsessed with the chemistry of his own mortality, employing a team of private doctors to monitor his blood pressure and heart rate with the same precision he once applied to the muzzle velocity of a naval gun. Secondary characters in this period included the legendary spy Robert Baden-Powell and the mysterious Sidney Riley, the ace of spies. Zaharov crossed paths with these men in the shadows of the Paris Peace Conference, where he lobbied for the creation of new states in the Middle East that would serve as future markets for Vickers weaponry. While the diplomats discussed the self-determination of nations, Zaharov was focused on the technical boundaries of oil pipelines. He was the hidden hand behind the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, now BP, ensuring that the British Navy's transition from coal to oil remained under his sphere of influence. He was a man with 5 different passports and no true homeland, a ghost who haunted the corridors of the Quai d'Orsay and Downing Street. By 1922, the chamber of ashes was nearly full. Zaharov had burned tens of thousands of documents, the acrid smoke from his fireplace a final testament to the secrets he carried. He was attempting to erase the Merchant of Death and leave only Sir Basil Zaharov, philanthropist. But the ink he had used, a high-quality iron gall composition, left a ghostly residue on the hearth that no fire could fully consume. The world was changing. The era of the gentleman arms dealer was being replaced by the era of corporate transparency and public hearings. Zaharov knew that his greatest battle was no longer against a rival empire, but against the light of the truth. He had spent his life selling the tools of the fire, and now he was desperately trying to stop the flames from reaching his own doorstep. The decade following the Great War did not bring the tranquility Basil Zaharov had anticipated. Instead, it ushered in a period of unprecedented public exposure and financial catastrophe. The macroeconomic context of the early 1920s was defined by the collapse of the wartime boom and a surging wave of global pacifism. In 1919, the League of Nations Covenant, specifically Article 8, declared that the manufacture by private enterprise of munitions and implements of war is open to grave objections. For the first time, the system Zaharov was not merely a trade secret, it was a target for international legislation. The moral tide was turning against the Merchants of Death, a term that began to circulate in the burgeoning tabloid press and investigative pamphlets of the era. Zaharov, however, was preoccupied with his final, most disastrous gamble, the Greco-Turkish War of 1919-1922. Technically, the Greek invasion of Asia Minor was a logistical nightmare that Zaharov personally financed to the tune of $4 million. A staggering $280 million in 2026 purchasing power. He bypassed the formal Greek treasury, providing direct lines of credit to the government of Eleftherios Venizelos to purchase Vickers aircraft, mountain guns, and millions of rounds of ammunition. The goal was the realization of the Megali idea, the restoration of a Greek empire centered in Constantinople. The technical failure of the campaign lay in the overextended supply lines across the scorched Anatolian plateau. While Zaharov's Vickers-supplied trucks struggled with the volcanic soil and mechanical breakdowns caused by the intense heat, the Turkish nationalist forces under Mustafa Kemal utilized localized guerrilla tactics and French-supplied weaponry, ironically some of it sold by Zaharov's own subsidiaries. The disaster reached its climax with the burning of Smyrna in 1922. As the city was reduced to ash, Zaharov's dream of a Mediterranean monopoly collapsed. The financial blow was accompanied by a political earthquake in London, the Chanak crisis. Zaharoff was accused of manipulating British Prime Minister David Lloyd George into a near war with Turkey to protect his personal investments in the region. The subsequent fall of the Lloyd-George coalition in 1922 stripped Zaharoff of his primary political shield. He was no longer the untouchable consultant. He was a liability. The British House of Commons began to echo with demands for an inquiry into his influence, with MPs questioning how a foreign national had acquired such leverage over the British cabinet. Archive curiosities from the mid-1920s reveal the sophistication of the legal and moral battle against him. The United States Senate, through the Nye Committee, began a sprawling investigation into the munitions industry. Although the committee's peak was in 1934, its agents spent years tracing the technical pathways of Zaharoff's money laundering through the Banque de la Seine and various Swiss holding companies. They discovered that Zaharoff had perfected the triangular trade of corruption. A bribe would be paid in Paris, to a journalist in Berlin, to influence a politician in London, to secure a contract in South America. The complexity of these transactions was so great that it required the birth of modern forensic accounting to decode them. Zaharoff responded by hiring a phalanx of the world's most expensive lawyers, paying annual retainers of $5 million in 2026 value to ensure that no subpoena could ever reach his hand. Secondary characters in this period of reckoning included the investigative journalist Dorothy Detzer and the socialist writer H.G. Wells, who modeled the villainous arms dealer in his works after Zaharoff. These figures represented a new kind of threat, the power of the public narrative. Zaharoff attempted to buy their silence, but the Great Depression of 1929 had made the public hungry for a scapegoat. The mystery man was now the aboutre, the vulture. He found himself defending his reputation in the courts of public opinion, a theater where his usual weapons of bribery and shadow deals were increasingly ineffective. He was forced to liquidate significant assets, including his shares in several oil companies, to maintain the liquidity necessary for his legal defense. The man who had orchestrated global wars was now fighting a defensive rearguard action against the slow, grinding machinery of international law. As the 1920s closed, Zaharoff's world had shrunk. The legal battles had not stripped him of his wealth. He remained a billionaire by any modern standard, but they had stripped him of his invisibility. The technical mastery he once held over the world's arsenals was being superseded by a new generation of corporate arms dealers who favored boardroom transparency over back-alley whispers. Zaharoff was becoming an anachronism, a Gilded Age ghost in a world of radio broadcasts and mass political movements. He retreated deeper into his personal life, hoping that his long-awaited marriage to the Duchess would provide the sanctuary that the world of business no longer could. The final decade of Basil Zaharoff's life was defined by a retreat into a physical and psychological isolation that was as technically elaborate as it was tragic. In September 1924, after the death of the Duke of Marchena in an asylum, Zaharoff finally married Maria del Pilar at the Château de Balancourt. He was 75 years old. She was 56. The wedding was a somber, high-security event, shielded from the public by a cordon of private guards. The Merchant of Death had waited 30 years for this moment of legitimacy, but the victory was hollow. Within 18 months, the Duchess succumbed to a rapid and agonizing illness. Her death in 1926 shattered the last of Zaharoff's emotional resilience. He became a recluse, abandoning his grand estates to occupy a permanent, high-security suite at the Hôtel de Paris in Monte Carlo. The technical layer of his isolation in Monte Carlo was a masterpiece of paranoid engineering. Zaharoff's suite was a self-contained fortress within the hotel. He had a private elevator installed, the mechanics of which were serviced only by a trusted engineer from London. The elevator's shaft was reinforced with lead-lined panels to prevent eavesdropping via early electronic microphones. He moved through the hotel in a bespoke wheelchair, a technical marvel for the 1930s. Constructed of high-tensile steel and lightweight aluminum alloys, the chair featured pneumatic rubber tires and an adjustable silver-plated frame. His physical decline was marked by severe rheumatism and a failing heart. conditions he treated with an array of experimental medicines, including early forms of aspirin and glandular extracts that cost the equivalent of $5,000 per dose today. The macro context of the 1930s was one of gathering storms. While Zaharoff withered in his chair, the world he had helped arm was once again marching toward a total conflict. The rise of Nazi Germany and the rearmament of the Soviet Union were processes he watched with a detached professional cynicism from his balcony overlooking the Mediterranean. He was no longer the architect of these movements. He was their retired mentor. The technical requirements of warfare had shifted to tanks and aircraft, technologies he had funded in their infancy, but which had now evolved beyond his direct control. He saw the Vickers Company struggle to compete with the new state-funded industrial machines of the dictators. The world was entering a total war economy where individuals like Zaharoff were redundant. Archive curiosities of his life in the 1930s detail the obsessive silence of his iron fortress. He employed a staff of 16 personal servants who were sworn to absolute secrecy. They were prohibited from speaking in his presence unless addressed directly. His diet was strictly controlled. He consumed only steamed fish, dry toast, and a specific vintage of mineral water bottled at a spring he had purchased years prior. The cost of maintaining this lifestyle in the depths of the Depression was roughly $3 million per year in 2026 currency. He spent his afternoons listening to early radio broadcasts on a customized shortwave receiver, a device encased in a mahogany cabinet with silver dials which allowed him to monitor the stock exchanges and political crises of Europe in real time. Secondary characters in his final years were his personal secretary and his doctors, who became his only link to the outside world. He treated them with a mixture of immense generosity and crushing suspicion. He would often order his secretary to burn a stack of papers in his presence, only to demand a detailed report on the contents of the ashes an hour later. His paranoia was fueled by the Merchants of Death hearings in Washington, which continued to haunt his legacy. He knew that the world was waiting for him to die to feast on his secrets. He became obsessed with the concept of posthumous security, designing a series of legal trusts and secret directives to ensure that his private archives would be destroyed upon his final breath. By 1935, Zaharoff was a ghost in a gold-plated cage. He would sit for hours on the terrace of the Hotel de Paris, wrapped in heavy wool blankets despite the Mediterranean heat. He watched the yachts of the new elite, men who had made their fortunes in oil and automobiles, and compared them to the dreadnoughts of his youth. The man who had sold the fire now feared the cold. He had built a fortress that no army could breach, but he had forgotten to leave himself a way out. He was waiting for the final liquidation, the only transaction he could not manipulate, while the fire in his fireplace continued to consume the evidence of a life spent in the service of the grave. On the morning of November 27, 1936, the biological machinery of Basil Zaharoff reached its point of terminal failure. Within the gilded confines of the Hotel de Paris, the air was stagnant, smelling of the antiseptic tinctures used by his private physicians and the faint, lingering scent of burnt cellulose. Zaharoff was 87 years old. The technical cause of his decline was a combination of chronic hypostatic pneumonia and congestive heart failure, a condition where the heart's ventricles can no longer pump blood efficiently, leading to a slow, suffocating accumulation of fluid in the lungs. His medical team, led by elite French specialists who were paid a daily retainer equivalent to $8,500 in 2026 values, monitored his fading pulse with clinical detachment. They utilized the most advanced diagnostic tools of the era, including early mercury sphygmomanometers and binaural stethoscopes. But there was no chemical or mechanical intervention that could reverse the systemic collapse of a man who had outlived his century. The macroeconomic context of November 1936 was a chilling forecast of the chaos Zaharoff had helped set in motion. While he lay dying, the Spanish Civil War was serving as a testing ground for the next generation of German and Soviet armaments, the Junkers Ju-52 bombers and the T-26 tanks. The London Stock Exchange was fluctuating wildly as the British government initiated its frantic rearmament program, a multi-billion-dollar industrial mobilization that Zaharoff's former company, Vickers Armstrongs, was spearheading. The era of the individual merchant of death was being liquidated in favor of the total state military complex. Zaharov, ever the strategist, understood that his death was the final transaction in a life of cold balances. His final command, delivered with a rasping breath to his trusted valet, was not for a priest, but for the fireplace. He watched as the final remnants of his private correspondence, the papers he had spent days sorting, were fed into the flames. This was the destruction of the ultimate archive. The records of suborned ministers, the technical blueprints of sabotaged rivals, and the secret bank codes of the Gilded Age. The inventory of his suite at the time of his death was a study in sterile luxury. Archive records detail the presence of 40 bespoke silk shirts from London's Jermyn Street, each hand-stitched with a thread count that would cost $400 per garment today. He possessed a collection of over 200 state decorations, including the Grand Cross of the Bath, housed in velvet-lined mahogany cases. These medals, forged from gold, silver, and enamel, represented the gratitude of nations he had systematically bled dry. Yet amidst this hoard of metal and silk, the most significant item was a small, silver-framed photograph of Maria del Pilar, the Duchess of Marchena. She was the only human variable in a life of mathematical cruelty. The room itself was an architectural fortress. The heavy brocade curtains were drawn tight, and the Louis XIV clocks had been stopped to prevent the irritation of their rhythmic ticking. Zaharov died in a silence so profound it was almost mechanical. Secondary characters in this final act were the hotel staff and the local authorities of Monaco, who moved with practiced discretion to secure the site. The Prince of Monaco, whose principality's treasury had been stabilized by Zaharov's control of the casino, ensured that the news of the death was managed with the utmost sensitivity. There was no public lying in state. Instead, Zaharov's body was prepared for transport with the same logistical precision he once used for a shipment of naval guns. The technical process of embalming utilized a mixture of formaldehyde and glycerin, a chemical preservation intended to maintain the mystery man for his final journey to the Château de Balancourt. The cost of the funeral arrangements, including the private train and the specialized lead-lined casket, exceeded $15,000, approximately $1.1 million in 2026. The death of Basil Zaharov marked the end of the individualist era of the arms trade. He had survived the Ottoman collapse, the Great War, and the fall of empires, always emerging wealthier from the rubble. He had mastered the chemistry of the Maxim gun and the metallurgy of the dreadnought, but in the end, he was a victim of the very time he had tried to weaponize. As his heart gave its final, irregular beat, the fire in the Larera died down to a pile of gray ash. The secrets were gone, vaporized into the Mediterranean air, leaving behind only the cold, hard currency of his estate. The boy from Tatavla had finally settled his account with the world, but the machinery he had built was only just beginning to accelerate. The liquidation of the Zaharov estate was a logistical operation that spanned 3 continents and a decade of legal disputes. His liquid fortune, estimated at $50 million at its peak, was dispersed through a web of trusts and foundations that he had designed to be as labyrinthine as a Vickers submarine. In 2026 terms, this wealth represents nearly $4 billion. Yet much of it vanished into the administrative mists of the post-war era. The Château de Balancourt, the architectural crown jewel of his empire, was eventually sold and its contents auctioned off. The 18th century tapestries and the gold leaf furnishings that once hosted kings were scattered to private collections, their origins often omitted from the provenance records. The estate itself fell into a state of elegant decay, a silent monument to a man who owned everything but belonged nowhere. The macro context of the mid-20th century saw the System Zaharov become the standard operating procedure for the global defense industry. The transition from individual agents to the military-industrial complex, as warned by Eisenhower, was the ultimate realization of Zaharov's vision. The technical evolution of the Maxim gun led directly to the development of the M61 Vulcan and the modern Gatling systems used on supersonic jets. The Vickers Company, through a series of mergers and nationalizations, eventually evolved into BAE Systems, a corporate titan that manages the defense requirements of dozens of nations. Zaharov's innovation, the triangular trade of armaments where a dealer supplies all sides of a conflict, remains the technical blueprint for modern proxy wars and the global arms market, which today exceeds $2 trillion in annual turnover. Secondary characters in the legacy of Zaharov include his biographers, most notably Robert Newman, who struggled for years to separate the man from the myth. Zaharov had been so successful in his campaign of dissimulation that many of the facts of his early life remained contested. His heirs, if they can be called that, were not his distant relatives, but the lobbyists and consultants who today occupy the boardrooms of defense contractors. These modern-day Zaharovs utilize the same tools of subornation and media manipulation, though updated for the digital age with social media algorithms and offshore tax havens. The Zaharov Prize for Aviation, which he established at the University of Paris, still exists, a subtle irony for a man who funded the research that allowed bombers to level the very cities he once visited as a young pimpante. Archive curiosities reveal that for decades Zaharov's grave at Ballancourt remained unmarked by his name, as per his final instructions. He sought the ultimate anonymity in death, just as he had in life. The mystery man wanted to be forgotten, yet his name continues to appear in the footnotes of every major historical analysis of the 20th century. In Monte Carlo, the Société des Bains de Mer, which he once controlled with an iron hand, remains a pillar of the monegasque economy, though the gamblers who lose millions at the tables today have no knowledge of the arms dealer who once owned the house. The technical ruins of his empire are not made of stone and mortar, but of the global contracts and treaty loopholes he helped draft. Zaharov's true legacy is the normalization of the business of blood. He proved that war is not a disruption of the market, but its most profitable state. He technicalized the sale of death, removing the moral friction from the transaction through the use of shell companies, bribes, and national security exemptions. The modern world is a Zaharov world, a place where the caliber of a rifle matters more than the cause it serves, and where the man who sells the fire is always the one most protected from the heat. He was the architect of a world that has learned to live with the permanent threat of its own destruction, provided the dividends remain high. The ruins of Basil Zaharov are found in the silent ballistics of 1 million forgotten battlefields and the cold digital balances of the world's secret banks. He was the man who sold the fire, and in doing so, he ensured that the world would never truly know peace again. He discovered, perhaps too late, that while gold can buy the silence of men and the loyalty of kings, it is a poor insulation against the judgment of history. Basil Zaharov died as he lived, enveloped in the luxury of his own making, a ghost in a fortress of gold, leaving behind a world that is still paying the interest on his blood-soaked loans.